Our next speaker is Jaye Marchiandi. Jaye's always been passionate about environmental issues, and for that reason, he began full-time studying environmental science in 2015 at RMIT. In 2019, Jaye started his PhD in environmental science, analytical chemistry here in ALEC, and he's currently in his second year of his PhD. He's currently investigating the impacts of endocrine disrupting chemicals on reproductive health in the Australian population. Thanks, Jaye.
Thanks for the introduction, Brad. All right, hi everyone. Like Brad said, I'm a second year PhD student under the supervision of Brad, Dr. Mark Green, and Dr. Sonia Dagnino. And today I'll be talking about a relatively recent event and our recently published data of the accidental discharge of PFAS into a local waterway from an industrial fire of unknown chemical stockpiles. To briefly summarize the fire events, at 5 AM, August 30th, 2018, a large fire engulfed a chemical storage facility, which reportedly housed around 100,000 drums of chemical waste. According to the EPA, this waste was mixtures of ketones, phenols, BTEX, and PFAS. It took firefighters around 17 hours to fully extinguish the fire, and then 13 days to extinguish all major hotspots. And this was done through the use of 30,000 litres of fluorine-free foam concentrate. It says fluorine-free, it says fluorine foam, but it should be fluorine-free foam concentrate. Due to the severity of the fire, the intensity of the fire, and the rapid response of firefighters, unfortunately, there was a lot of fire water runoff that went into the adjacent creek, which is Stony Creek. And according to the EPA, thousands of aquatic wildlife were found dead downstream on the banks of the river. And reportedly to this day, firefighters who responded to this event still suffer from multiple illnesses. But why should we care about PFASs? Well, fortunately, we've had a lot of great speakers today, which have talked about the effects of PFASs and why it's so important to actually look for these compounds. PFASs are an ever-growing family of fluorinated compounds, which we use in our daily lives, from a lot of consumer products and a lot of industrial products as well. And they come with a lot of negative side effects, including their toxicity to humans and animals, their persistence and mobility in the environment, as well as their bioaccumulation as well. And this is particularly relevant in Australia, where we have a lot of townships which have been affected by PFAS contamination, either in the local drinking water supply or the produce as well. And in these townships, the local governments or the environmental authorities have advised residents to either not drink the local water or to not consume the local produce. The purpose of this investigation was to determine whether there was a large-scale and long-term PFAS contamination which arose from this fire, which was one of the largest chemical fires that has been reported in Australia to date. To achieve this, we collected 5 samples in triplicate from 5 different locations over the span of 8 kilometres. We took 2 upstream as our reference sites, which was roughly 400 metres from the actual fire itself. And then we took a further 2 samples downstream as well. And we did this from 3 time points. The first was on the 3rd day of firefighting. The second was roughly 2 months later. And the third was roughly 2 years later. Once samples were collected, they were taken back to the lab where they were sterilized to prevent any potential microbial growth or degradation of precursors, where they then underwent solid phase extraction and then quantification with an LC-MS triple quad. We had 44 analytes of interest ranging from C4 to C14 from 9 different PFAS classes. And these are represented here with our recoveries. So as we can see, there's acceptable recoveries for most compounds based on the EPA recovery limits. The only compounds that didn't make this were disam-PAP. There's a novel sulfonamide, perfluorobutane sulfonamide, which is FBSA, and 2 perfluoroalkylphosphinic acids as well. We still report these compounds though, just semi-qualitatively. And our findings are quite apparent. As you can see at site 3 during campaign 1, there was a significant deposition of PFAS into the water. We actually recorded up to 70 times higher at the point source compared to the upstream sites, where then it gradually declines downstream and throughout the time points as well. The water profiles were dominated mostly by your fluorotelmosulfonic acids, your perfluoroalkyl-carboxylic acids, and your perfluoroalkyl-sulfonic acids as well. As you can see from campaigns 2 and 3, the some PFAS levels decreased up to 83% after 2 months and up to 90% after 2 years. Despite this substantial decrease, we do still see a 3 to 6 times higher PFAS concentration at the point source compared to the upstream sites 2 years later. But it's important to note that these levels are largely reflective of the remediation that occurred with by Melbourne Water, in which I believe 55 million litres of contaminated water were removed by day 3, so actually the day of sampling during campaign 1, and around 170 million cubic metres of contaminated sediment was removed by September 24th. Figure 4 visually summarises the data from all time points, categorised by their location. We see by upstream, point source, and downstream. This is to represent the significant correlations between PFASs, which are indicated by red, at the point source and downstream. So we can see, we did see strong to very strong correlations between most PFASs, but it was mostly the dominant PFASs from your FTSAs, namely 6,2-FTSA, your PFCAs and PFSAs, which are mainly comprised of PFOS, PFOA, and PFBA as well. We then looked at the downstream spatial trends from the point source, so being site 3, and then site 5 as well. We did this over each time point for your major PFAS classes. So as expected, there was a logarithmic decrease for most PFAS classes with increasing distance from the fire site. The only exception to this was DIPAPs, which we saw an increase in concentration downstream. We can only speculate on these data, but we think there might be some downstream inputs of DIPAPs further downstream. I thought I'd also include PFAS there. Drew mentioned PFAS as an emerging PFAS. So this compound has been used as a anti-erosion inhibitor in aircraft hydraulic fluids for decades now, but it has only been recently reported in the literature in the last 10 years. And PFAS has been associated with similar effects to that of PFOS. And this is actually one of the highest reporting limits for PFAS in the literature. We found its highest concentration to be around 80 nanograms per litre in water, whereas in Drew's slide before, the highest is still held by Wang, which is around nearly 200 nanograms per litre. So it's very high. We then took concentration data and compared it with ecological water quality guideline values for PFOS and PFOA, as well as the recreational water limit for the combined value of PFOS and PFHXS. And we also included the European Union's average annual environmental quality standard, which is used as a long-term contamination assessment. So as we can see, that PFOS exceeded the 99% species protection limit, which is of 0.23 nanograms per litre. This limit is meant to be protective of 99% of the species in that region. And it also exceeded the average annual environmental quality standard set by the European Union at 0.65 nanograms per litre. This is unsurprising because according to literature, the background levels for PFOS are much higher than these two values. But what is surprising though is that PFOS exceeded the 95% species protection limit of 130 nanograms per litre, both in campaign 1 and campaign 2, so 2 months after the event. This indicates that PFOS may have posed a short-term risk or an acute risk to aquatic organisms at the site. And we also see that the combined value of PFOS and PFHXS during campaign 1 was very close to exceeding the recreational water limit for humans, which is important considering that there was recreational anglers during the actual fire itself. So I hope they didn't eat that fish. But as for PFOA, its levels were orders of magnitude lower than its threshold value. To summarize, we found at least 42 PFASs were released into Stony Creek, adjacent from the large-scale urban industrial fire. Out of the 42 PFASs, 44 PFASs, we found that 6,2-FTSA and PFOS were the dominant PFASs released into the water. This may indicate their similar uses, as these two compounds are used both in chromium electroplating, as well as firefighting foams as well. As I mentioned earlier, the PFAS exceeded the 95% species detection limit 2 months after the incident. The some PFAS levels decreased nearly 100% 2 years later, but they were still 3 to 6 times higher than upstream sites. And we report emerging and novel PFAS, namely PFAS and FBSA, were detected in the Australian environment for the first time. And we'd like to use this study to emphasize that the stockpiling PFAS waste may represent an emerging global problem in regard to long-term environmental PFAS contamination. Thank you.